down here too.
Avery's on there.
Yep. She's coming back.
Where's she at?
I don't know if she'll be able to. I don't think she'll be video, but. Let's say hi.
You know, just under a message and so
Okay.
I've been trying to.
Okay. I don't. If you want to hang around and do an introduction, you're more than welcome to.
I got stuff to do.
Oh well. All right.
People aren't coming to a webinar to say hi to Eric. They're coming to listen to Stacy.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being patient and waiting today. So my name is Annabelle Escamilla. For those who may know me by my maiden name, it was Kettle. So there's that name change. Welcome to our webinar today with Dr. Stacy Andis. We are thrilled to have you here today. She's got a wonderful presentation lined up for you. We're really excited to see how this conversation can pan out and how we can help develop this on campuses. Now, with this feature on GoToWebinar, you are able to text any comments, questions, and that'll be through the question feature. The chat feature is mainly for presenters, and we can send those out to you. Otherwise, it will be the question section. And if you have any questions, you can either send them directly and I will moderate, or we can wait till the end. Anything else? Those of you who are needing CPU credits and things like that, I will send out an email with a survey link at the end, or I'll actually send out a couple hours later. And then once you get that, it'll give us some feedback and help you move forward. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Stacy Andis.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and make sure that's all working correctly before I hop in. It looks like my screen is showing. Is that right? Awesome. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with all of you today. My name is Stacy Andis, and I am the Director of Health Promotion at Villanova University, just outside of Philadelphia. And I'm going into my 23rd year in higher ed, 22 of those in health promotion and 20 of those in Catholic higher ed. So I don't know if any of you here today are at Catholic institutions, but I always like to share that in case that's a point of connection for you. I've also represented the American College Health Association on the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education Board since the 2010s. And I've also been pretty involved in revision of standards of practice, both with ACHA and with CAT because of that role largely. And then most recently, and I think really most relevant to what I'm sharing with all of you today, I'm also a founding partner of the brand new Collaborative Center for Restorative Practices, which is housed with the International Institute for Restorative Practices, or you'll hear me talk about IIRP. Which is based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which just happens to be about 45 minutes down the road from me here at Villanova. And this is really where my journey began nearly 4 years ago now, with integrating restorative practices into my work in health promotion and higher ed. So let's get our slides going here. Okay. So I've organized our short time together today to connect the dots between restorative practices, health promotion, and prevention. I'm going to focus in specifically on listening circles as just one restorative practice, but it's one that I have worked to integrate in my work in a number of ways that I'll share with you today. And then also wanted to share with you how I've integrated listening circle process into our peer educator training, into our programs, and into an intervention as well here at Villanova. So I am going to share a short video link with you. I think what I'll do, I have two links I would like to share with you. I'll share it with you at the close of the presentation in the chat, and then I certainly will share my slides and those links with Annabelle to share with all of you afterwards as well, so that you can consult two things. One is a short video link that kind of talks a little bit about what restorative practices is. I think it's a great short several-minute video that you could easily share with others if this is something you're exploring or looking to explore on your campus after today. And then also I will share a PDF with you of a document called Defining Restorative, which again is authored by IIRP. And what I really love about this document is it does make some explicit connections to public health, restorative practice, and prevention, even explicitly speaking to elements of the IOM or the Institute of Medicine protractor. So for those of you who are familiar with health promotion practice, which I assume is probably all of you today, I think you'll clearly see these connections in the video and in the document that I'll send along to you. But the quote here, I took right from that document, Defining Restorative. And I'd just like to read a portion of it out. Where a network of relationships are already established, quote, it is easier to respond effectively to wrongdoing and restore social order, unquote. And in public health terms, as you'll see in that document, restorative justice is a version of tertiary prevention, whereas restorative practices really expands that vision and incorporates primary prevention or introducing something before the problem occurs. So many of you may be coming to this conversation, maybe a little more familiar with restorative justice, which is where I was 4 years ago before coming to this work. That is typically more readily recognized and understood in higher ed, but it really is just a subset of restorative practices. And so I want to just expand kind of what your thinking is about restorative as I'm going to be talking about it today, knowing that restorative justice is a component, but that much of what I'll be focusing on is restorative practices and looking through that health promotion and prevention lens. I also really love and would like to share that restorative practices is a social science. It is a newer social science, but it is a social science, and it connects disciplines from education and counseling and criminal justice and organizational management, and brings together those disciplines to really talk about using restorative in a variety of settings and spaces and places, which I also really appreciate about it. What you're looking at here is the social discipline window, which is really at the heart of restorative practices and where a lot of my conversations on my campus started. It suggests that, quote, human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to or for them. And so when we facilitate communities with high support and high accountability, we're actually creating restorative communities in the true sense of the word, in which the way we respond to and repair harm are not punitive, neglectful, or permissive, but that really, if we're really doing health promoting and preventative work, we're reducing even the occurrence of harm that need repair within our communities. So I mentioned that I will be speaking specifically to the listening circle process, but I just want to preface this by saying that restorative practices as a whole, again, kind of moving out from the restorative justice subset, but restorative practices are cumulative, and they are important for setting the stage for community building, for enhancing safety, and for helping to create a sense of belongingness, which I know many of us are talking more and more about today. The listening circle can be the scaffolding for responsive efforts that may be aimed at repairing harm between individuals when harm does occur. It supports listening. It provides space for repairing harm between individuals and with individuals and in the community, and restoring a sense of safety. But listening circles are not restorative conferences, which is often what I find people come to the conversation, maybe with a little more familiarity with, which is intending to repair harm between individuals or providing some sense of restorative justice. So listening circles, as I'm talking about them today, is a specific kind of circle in restorative practice that is designed to help people process an event or an issue that poses a challenge or harm to a community or has actually impacted people in a significant way. So one example, when I first started integrating listening circles, it was at the start of COVID. And so we were looking often at using the listening circle process as a way to bring people together who needed space to process shared and different experiences in living in a world with COVID. So that's just one example of how that might be different from a restorative conference, which is really bringing people together with the aim of repairing harm between individuals. The purpose of the listening circle process is to give people space to express their thoughts and feelings about an event or a topic or an issue or a time, where they can begin to explore connectedness or collective experience. And it fills an essential role in providing a forum that is community impact focused and not just focused on how does this affect me, but how does this affect we. The systematic use of restorative practices has a cumulative impact, as I mentioned earlier, and it helps to create that overall restorative environment that ideally is operating in the proactive space by building relationships and developing community, and less in the reactive space where we're often repairing harm and restoring relationship. And so important to know that there is research to demonstrate that organizations that only use that reactive or responsive or restorative justice approach without restorative practices tend to be less successful than those who also employ the proactive. And there's some research to demonstrate that. And I would like to share, when you get the PDF document that I share with you, you'll notice that a lot of the research and the evidence is not necessarily in the higher ed space, but it is in those other disciplinary spaces that I mentioned, from education to counseling, to criminal justice, to organizational management. And so the collaborative center that I am part of is helping to build the evidence base around applying restorative practices in the higher education space. So what does the listening circle process provide? And how can it support, my world? I'm very focused on well-being and thriving. And so I also wanted to speak to how they can support thriving. So a listening circle is a versatile restorative practice that can be used proactively to develop relationships and build community, or reactively to respond to wrongdoing or conflict. Listening circles give people an opportunity to speak and to listen to one another in an atmosphere of safety, decorum, and equality. Listening circles allow people to tell their stories and also offer their own perspectives. They can serve a variety of purposes, and the couple ways that we have used them, you'll see how we have used them for very different reasons. They can serve as space for healing, for support, for decision-making, for relationship development, just to name a few. And they also provide questions relating to a specific topic, event, shared experience, as I mentioned earlier in using the COVID example. But it allows for one person to speak at a time with a lot of structure and predictability. And I'll share with you a little more specifically about that, how that looks for us and why that has been important in our listening circle process. I think it's just as important for you to realize what listening circles do not provide. So they do not facilitate intergroup dialogue. Some of you may have heard of IGR. I know my campus employs IGR, and with more and more with each year, which is, again, grounded in dialogue, just as it sounds, which relies on an exchange of ideas and an opportunity to talk with one another about a topic, event, or experience. The listening circle is an opportunity to listen and be heard, but it is not an opportunity to debate or dialogue necessarily. It can be a precursor to those things, but the listening circle process itself is not a tool for dialogue. And so you may, as you're thinking about and hearing how we utilize the listening circle process, may delineate how you might employ the listening circle process yourself differently than you might other spaces where you are looking to create dialogue. Also, just to note that listening circles are not support groups in which there is an expert person serving as a facilitator, advising, or giving feedback in that space to address whatever it is that those people are coming together to talk about. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle in distinguishing it from an IGR or an intergroup dialogue or a debate or dialogue space. And you'll see why, because the role of our listening circle facilitators can actually look quite different than what we're used to seeing, at least for me in my work as someone who's delivered many trainings, presentations, workshops. As the trainer or the facilitator, I am often guiding the conversation, pulling on certain ideas, making connections as the facilitator. But in the circle process, we are allowing people to do that themselves and not stepping into an expert or leadership role in that process. So what do listening circle facilitators do? So they create a space where all participants feel welcome. They apply the same structure and equity in the process that they facilitate. What's important here when I talk to you about the various components of the listening circle process is that with just a few exceptions, the process is exactly the same no matter what listening circle is being facilitated. So the more listening circles that a person participates in, the more predictable that process becomes, which can be really important, especially given some of the ways in which my campus has been using the listening circle process to provide students or staff or faculty, depending on who you're facilitating the process with. It provides a level of predictability, expectation, and structure to what can sometimes be very challenging or difficult conversations for people. And so it helps to remove some of those concerns or questions about what will happen or what can I expect participating in a listening circle. They also provide the opportunity for every person to sit with discomfort because, again, you are speaking and being heard, but you're listening to others. You are not challenging or pushing back on something that another person said. And so sometimes maybe another person's perspective or experience doesn't align with your own. And that can be challenging to not be able to respond to that other person in the structure of the listening circle. And so it does provide an opportunity for people to challenge themselves to really and truly listen without the expectation for yourself or for others to respond to what you're sharing. The other thing that really distinguishes this process, I've already alluded to it a little bit, is the facilitator themselves also are participants. So the same questions that we ask the people in the circle to respond to, the facilitator is also answering those same questions. They are intentional. They're not neutral because they have their own perspectives and experiences that they're bringing to the conversation. And so they are not expected to have a neutral idea or experience themselves. They are simply meant to bring their authentic selves to the extent that they're comfortable to that conversation or that circle. And they are also our referral source. So often I mentioned the listening circle facilitator sometimes just happen to be a campus expert, but they're not always, because most of how we use our listening circle process are with our students. So it's student to student led listening circles in most cases. And they are not empowered to act as experts. I'm sure many of you, if you oversee peer educators or some sort of student leadership program, you're not training your students to be expert on all things, but you are training them on how to make an effective referral. Where are the appropriate resources or services on campus that might benefit a student around that conversation or the topic that you're focusing on? And so they're trained and provided with that information as part of the listening circle process when they close out the process to remind the participants of how to access resources and supports, where they might go, how they can help connect students directly to resources as well. And in some cases, to the extent they're comfortable talking about their own use of those resources to help to kind of demystify those resources and services available to students. And the listening circle process is what we typically, and when we were trained by the International Institute for Restorative Practices, is what we call an invitation to brave space. One of the practices that are inherent in every listening circle process is we always have a grounding practice fairly early on in the introduction of the process. And this is one that many of us use often. We think it really encapsulates the listening circle process well. And so this is one of the grounding practices that we use. And I'll just take a moment to read it out. I think it's pretty powerful and really explains the listening circle process as we intend it. So together we will create brave space because there's no such thing as a quote unquote safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world and we amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. The space will not be perfect, and it will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So again, this is just a way to introduce, especially if we know we have a relatively new group to listening circle process. This is a nice way to sort of introduce some of the key components of the listening circle. So what does this look like at Villanova? So we are currently we're going into year 4. So I want to share with you a little bit how that has looked over the years that we have slowly integrated this into the way that we work. So in year 1, which was the fall of 2020, which should sound familiar to all of you, we trained staff and faculty to start. And again, largely in response to COVID and being very concerned about trying to stay connected with our students and trying to create ways to really offer spaces for our students to connect with each other and with us, particularly around the shared experience of COVID. And so we thought the best way to start with this, we had to deviate a little bit from our initial plans, but the best place to start would be for the staff and faculty who teach a first-year seminar course around a number of themes. I happen to teach several sections of a healthy living learning community. But we trained all of those folks to have the listening circle process sort of in their back pocket. So they might integrate it into maybe the first month of classes as a way to check in with their students and allow them to connect with each other and talk about how they were doing. They could use it at another point in the semester around a particular source of anxiety or topic that had come up in their class experience with these students. So, you know, this was our first year. We trained faculty and staff. We gathered some feedback from those who used the process in some way and kind of reevaluated how we wanted to use the process moving forward with IIRP. And we decided that we really wanted to use the listening circle process first and foremost as a tool for our students. So we started out by looking at POWER, which is our peer education program. We decided, okay, we're going to train all of our POWER peer educators in listening circle process so that if we receive requests for what would be your traditional programs, we might steer those requesting more in the direction of a listening circle that would open up opportunities for students to connect and again, over a shared experience, and then be reminded of and connected to resources and services for support. And we felt like where we were at that time, the state of the world, the state of COVID, you know, lots happening in our world politically, the climate, you know, conversations elevating around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness. There was a lot that our students needed and wanted to be talking about with one another, but because of the nature of our work at that time and having to work, you know, still largely in the virtual space in year 1 and year 2, how could we create some spaces to do that? In year 3, we expanded that. We still continue to this day, but in year 3, trained all of our POWER students again, and then we expanded it and opened it up to others at the university who had students that they thought would be interested or that they wanted to have students trained for in their own departments or organizations so that they had that tool and skill set to use as they saw fit within their own student organizations and in their departments. So going into year 4, which will be this fall 23 for us, we're moving forward that same model. We will continue to train all of our new POWER members, and we'll continue to invite and add on student leaders who themselves are just interested on their own, are nominated by other staff and faculty, or are wanting to build that tool within their student organization or the department. So in our pilot year, I've kind of alluded to some of this. We did start, as I said, focused on that communitas or learning community experience and training those staff and faculty who are facilitating those groups of students for their first year, and really just focused on the transition, COVID-19, and really resilience were kind of the key areas that we focused on in year 1. It was open to any interested students, so we also offered them periodically through my office. We might post or market a listening circle we would always have registration because we needed to know how many students to expect, so we had enough facilitators, because in a moment I'll share with you some lessons learned and some recommendations from IIRP about size of small groups and really at what point should you cap the size of your listening circles. So we needed to know how many facilitators we needed to make sure that we kind of stayed true to that. And then we also, because we trained a significant number of student life staff in that year one, because many of us happen to teach in those learning community experiences, we also used the listening circle process, again virtually, because this was in fall of 2020. We were wrestling with, and still wrestle with, as I'm sure many of you are, about how to really take a look at our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness with our own staff, our hiring and recruitment strategies, but then of course how we create the kind of community that we want at Villanova as well for our students. And so we did listening circles virtually with smaller groups of student life staff led by other staff, and very intentional in sort of where we placed folks so they weren't in with their supervisor or other members of their staff, but had the opportunity to really talk critically about what are your experiences as professional staff at Villanova. What do you think we need to improve as a division, and what do you think we're doing well and that we need to do more of? And so creating those safe spaces, again, where nobody is debating or dialoguing, but they're able to share what their experience was at that time, and also hear the perspectives and experiences of others. And then year two and moving forward, so fall 2021 to the present time, this is sort of how we've been spending our time. There are three primary ways we have been using the listening group, or the listening circle process, excuse me. The first one, and the one for which I have some initial data to share with you, is our small group reflection process, which is intended to be led by our POWER student facilitators or our POWER peer educators. We also have all of our staff in health promotion are trained in listening circle process, so we're able to facilitate that process when we have enough students who have been referred to that process and maybe don't have enough of our peer educators to facilitate. So it is intended for student to student, but we also are able to kind of jump in with health promotion staff to facilitate as well. And that has had some interesting impacts on our data, which I'll share with you in a moment. We also have had, so in year two forward, as I mentioned, we started to also train other students who were interested from other organizations, departments. One of the areas that students emerged were around this idea of we really would like to have space for survivors of sexual violence, not led by a trained counselor. Like, we're not looking for a support group. We're just looking to connect with one another and really just talk about our shared experiences about being a Villanova student and a survivor. And so we have sustained since that time. Every year we ensure that we have at least 2 trained students who can facilitate what has now become, it started off as a monthly, it is now a bi-monthly listening circle that they market, and students who are interested in connecting can reach out to an email address that is not affiliated with any one person, but it's always connected to those 2 students who are leading the listening circle for that year. They, strategize as a group on the kinds of things that they want to talk about, and then the leaders take responsibility for preparing those questions and letting any new students who come into the fold or any students who have come to a previous listening circle know, hey, at the next listening circle, these are the questions we're going to be talking about. Again, to give those students their own sense of control, decision, and predictability. They already know the process that they've come before. And so the only thing that changes are those questions. So maybe the set of questions that those students have prepared for that next listening circle is something I'm not ready to talk about, or I'm not comfortable talking about, or I'm just not ready. And so they can opt out and come to a future listening circle that maybe focuses in on something that they are more comfortable or ready to talk about at some point. And then Snack and Chat with Power is something our Power peer educators have created. They do them, at this point, they're doing them about once a month. And what they do is they keep it very informal. This is just meant to be sort of around topics of interest. So I imagine in the coming year, we'll probably have some students who will want to give space to election anxiety. I know that's something that when we were at the fall of 2020 virtually, that was something we did offer as an opportunity to connect. But often our peers will talk about, snack and chat with power on adjusting as a first-year student, or snack and chat with power on, balancing, eating in the dining halls with, trying to eat healthy. So they try to pick topics they think, are important, they remember being challenging, that they would have appreciated to have like student-to-student conversation around. And so they do that periodically. We host that in our space, so they get to come down and see the Office of Health Promotion. They see the space that our students have access to. And then they always have, we have a popcorn maker. So usually they have like a popcorn snack bar, so everybody can get a little bit of a snack and just settle in and just have some good conversation. So these are the key restorative questions. These are not the questions that we use in all of our listening circles, but I thought it was important to share with you because these are sort of the IRP core questions. If you're looking to do a circle around responding to challenging behavior, these are the questions that we actually use in our small group reflection. And I'll share with you in just a moment a little bit more about that. But these are the questions, and the students get them ahead of time before they come to small group reflection, so they know exactly what they're going to be asked to reflect on and speak to. And then to help those harmed by others' actions, those are really questions that are used in a restorative conference kind of environment or circle, which are really looking to merge these two questions. So the person who had been harmed would respond to the questions related to challenging behavior, and then the person who has caused the harm, in the reverse. To respond to challenging behavior would be the person who caused harm, and to help those harmed by others' actions would be the person who had experienced harm. So on their own, we would look at, in terms of what my office has used, is the respond to challenging behavior with our small group reflection for students who have been referred to that process. Restorative justice or restorative conference would use both of these sets of questions when they bring students together. So just very generally speaking, again, I'm happy to share more with any of you who are interested, but just generally sharing with you, the listening circle structure, as I mentioned, is the same. The only thing that changed would be selection of a grounding practice, and then the questions themselves. So every circle script has a general welcome that outlines the reason for the gathering and introduces the facilitators. The preamble reminds the students of what a listening circle is and is not. It explains why the process or the structure is formal, and it reminds everyone that there are supports outside of the circle that will be reviewed once the circle has been closed. The agreements are what we would sort of typically think of as ground rules or expectations in the circle process. So it makes sure, that people are aware of, thinking about privacy of what is shared, passing on any question that you might be uncomfortable responding to, ensuring that only one person speaks at a time, and then speaking from the I perspective, which are probably all things you're all very familiar with from other processes. And then, opening up to the group, are there any other ground rules you'd like to set here before we continue? And sometimes we do have students sort of add in a thing or two that they want everyone else to be mindful of. The circle questions themselves, I mentioned, those are the things that change for every circle. And they're a set of 3 to 5 questions. If you can, and ideally I would say you would want students to register ahead of time so you have a sense of how many people who you're expecting to show up. You would send all of those people what those questions are ahead of time, so they have some time to opt in or opt out, and also give a little bit of thought to the questions ahead of time. I know for me, I'm someone who does process. I am less comfortable responding kind of in the moment than I am if I've had some time to think about them. So I'm certain there are students who feel the same. And then knowing that the circle questions are asked in order, one at a time, with the option for anyone to pass on any particular question. And then once everyone's had the opportunity to respond to question 1, you move on to question 2, use the same process, then you move on to question 3, and so on. Reflection of themes brings, if your group is larger than 6, because the recommended size of each listening circle group is 6 or less. If you have a group larger than that, you bring everyone back together and you reflect on the themes that have come up. And, you know, different facilitators do this differently. Sometimes the facilitator just takes the responsibility for reporting out some observations and themes from the group. Sometimes they'll invite their group to offer those to the large group. It's really up to the people running the listening circle to decide how they want to handle that. And then the last piece is once you've closed out the circle, that's sort of the official designation of this is where the listening circle structure and process ends. So anything that happens from here forward is no longer following the listening circle structure. So if people want to continue to stay and dialogue a little bit about the topic or the experience or conversation, they can do that, and they're not following the listening circle structure, you know, at any point at that time. They're just having conversation and dialogue. And then the sharing of resources and ways to continue the conversation are what we build into all of our processes to make sure whoever leaves that conversation, especially if they decide not to kind of stick around and continue to chat, that they're leaving with ways to connect back to other supports or to other students or to the facilitators after that listening circle process, if they ever need any more information or support in the future. So I talked and alluded to a little bit to small group reflection. And I just want to share with you very briefly what this is. There's a lot of information on this slide, but I'll kind of give you just an overview of what that process is. So small group reflection is a process that is by referral only. It is designed for students who have had significant one-time alcohol-related incidents like alcohol overdose and who have had the opportunity to meet with either our substance use counselor and our counseling center and have been referred to come to small group reflection. The core components you see represented here. So again, these are all students who have been referred because of a pretty significant incident related to alcohol. Often it is alcohol overdose, though sometimes it's not. It might be a little less severe than alcohol overdose, but they're all pretty high level experiences. And they're deemed appropriate to participate in small group reflection by our substance use counselor, who does have, who is a certified alcohol and other drug counselor. And the core components are designed to respond to wrongdoing, and the language is not necessarily what we use, but to wrongdoing, behavior, incident, fill in the blank, you know, different language here. It provides opportunities for students to resolve conflict around their own behavior, to receive support by sharing in the experience that others in the circle have also experienced, to receive information that will help them make healthier decisions moving forward. And then also before they leave, they do create one SMART goal that they are committing to that is specific and measurable and attainable, all those things, you know, the SMART acronym refers to, that will help them from a repeat experience, especially around alcohol overdose. And so that's how our process is set up. It is intended to be student to student led, but as I mentioned, that's not always possible given our makeup in terms of how many students we have trained at any given time. So I just, again, briefly want to share with you our logic model. And I'm going to go through this quickly, so you're probably not going to have a time to process everything you're looking at here on the screen. But for those of you who are not familiar with a logic model, I've just plugged in for you and shown how we've outlined our inputs, activities, our outputs, outcomes, and impact. And so you'll see here, again, that SGR is referral only. It's part of our conduct process. It is either facilitated by a health promotion staff member or a POWER community advocate, which is what we call our peer educators. Each small group reflection process is about 75 to 90 minutes. It's in part, you know, dependent on how talkative and how big and how many of the groups we have. Sometimes we have to split the group into 2 groups because we have more than 6 at any one time. And it does include pre-circle reflection. So those questions that I mentioned to you that we have these students answer, we send them ahead of time. But then we also ask them in the beginning as they're arriving and we have some quiet downtime, we have the questions up on the whiteboard and they have the chance to write down some of their thoughts to those questions, because again, we know students coming into this process especially are bringing in some anxieties related to the incident. So we want to give them some time. They've had the questions, but now maybe you want to write down some thoughts so that when it gets to you in the circle process for each of the questions, you've got some ideas or thoughts and reflections down that you can refer back to, which we have found to be really, really helpful in the process. And then our outputs, outcomes and impact. And again, we won't stay here long, and I will share these slides so you can kind of come back to them and see, you know, what we're looking at and ultimately what we're looking to measure as part of the small group reflection process for students who have been referred. So I'd like to share with you just a little bit of what we know. So you can see here, this is only 2 years worth because we've only been doing small group reflection for 2 years. I will tell you, year one was largely facilitated by health promotion staff because we were still training peer educators at that time. Year two was largely facilitated by our peer educator community advocates. And year three, we were back to largely facilitating by health promotion staff members. And that's because we lost a significant number who graduated. And so again, our numbers of students available to facilitate also kind of dropped again. So we had to compensate for some of those numbers. But overall, since 21, we have seen over 220 students go through small group reflection, just to give you a sense of what those numbers look like. And just a little bit more, 40% of those students were female identified and 80% of those students were first year students across those 2 years of data that you're looking at. As we are starting to process this year's data with the 22-23, you'll see that we are seeing positive outcomes across the board, but we're seeing stronger positive outcomes in 21-22. And we have been processing that a lot as a staff. And, you know, we have some ideas about maybe why those numbers look different, and you'll see that they also look a little different between those 2 years here as well. This data is around protective strategies. And, you know, we do suspect that the student-to-student led listening circle processes might be what is increasing some of the outcomes we're seeing, because the only consistent difference that we have been able to pinpoint between those 2 years has been who has largely been the facilitators. And in 22-23, we had more health promotion staff facilitating than we did in 21-22. You'll also notice that you're only looking at post small group reflection data. So also in this time, as many of you certainly can appreciate, we also had a significant turnover in staff, not in my, well, one in my area, but also in our Dean of Students and in the substance use counselor roles. And so some of the systems in which we operated to collect the data pre-referral got lost in the shuffle with a new system that we're using, with new staff picking up roles that they didn't normally have. And so some things fell through the cracks, one of which was the pre-assessment that we now give to students before they come into small group reflection. So we certainly want to know, what did their pre-small group reflection responses look like compared to their post? So right now we're just looking at comparing post to post data in 21-23. And then this is just about the process itself. Again, we wouldn't have pre-data here anyway, but again, you can even see just with some of their perceptions and how they received the process, still was significantly higher rated when it was largely facilitated by students. So again, we're still processing that ourselves, but that's one observation we've had that might account for some of that variation. Some of my lessons learned, and then I promise I will be quiet. I know we have just a little bit more time. I know you may have been sending in some questions or have some questions you'd like to unmute or put in the chat when I wrap here, but I do want to share some lessons learned. As I mentioned, we have 3 consistent listening circle processes that have been happening for the last 2 years: small group reflection, snack and chats with power, and survivors supporting survivors, which is now a bi-monthly listening circle instead of a once a month. We are open to evaluating those with our students. We are mindful that Survivors Supporting Survivors is sort of anonymous. We do not have access to those students, but there are ways I think we can get some feedback from those students to really measure outcomes and impact for that group. And we can certainly start doing that more with our snack and chats as we build up more students who are joining those conversations as well. But I will say that, you know, students are not seeking traditional led presentations, even by their peers today. And so we're really trying to change the way that we do our work, especially in our peer education space. And one of the major ways we've done that, and we think we're doing that well, is using the listening circle process. So just a couple things to keep in mind. They can work in the virtual environment. It is how I was initially trained to do listening circles. It has allowed for excellent time management, especially in the Zoom space with breakout rooms. It allows you to very intentionally create small groups to ensure that you're diversifying the groups, that you're separating people that are known to one another, that you're creating affinity groups where people have interest or where you think it is important to create affinity groups. So listening circles can work in the virtual environment. The structure works really well. I find that our students tend to have more anxiety when there is less structure in anything that they're doing. So the listening circle structure provides a lot of safety for them, in that, you know, they strategize with members of our staff largely to come up with questions. They're not required to do that, but they have access to us, so they generally do take advantage of that. But they can create those questions, they can lead those grounding practices, and then everything else is already organized and structured for them. And again, that safety and predictability that comes with that has been really powerful. They are not meant to replace or act in lieu of intergroup dialogue or dialogue-based initiatives. I would view the listening circle process as baseline, as beginning opportunities, but not as something I would see that our students from first year to senior year have only participated in listening circles. I think they absolutely need to be graduating and moving on to more dialogue-based initiatives for sure. I would absolutely recommend you build in resource review after you've closed the official process to make sure, again, that you're connecting people to additional supports and resources if they need it. And then I've already referenced a couple of these, but asking participants to register ahead of time is really ideal, especially if you have registration public. So I may see that there's another person registered that for whatever reason, I may not be comfortable participating in a circle with that person. Or if I see that, maybe I can reach out to the organizers and say, hey, I would prefer to not be in a group with this person, or, you know, how are you organizing groups, or give them an opportunity to sort of speak to any concerns they have if they see there are others that they might be somewhat uncomfortable with or may opt out of if they're seeing some other folks that they might be familiar with in the conversation. We can ask for participant preferences. So again, do you have a concern or a preference in terms of your facilitator identity? Do you want to participate in an affinity listening circle as opposed to kind of just whoever's here? And then of course, if you have, you know, you want people to have a chance to socialize before or after a listening circle process, you want to be able to have enough food and things to go around for everyone too. So that's just a practical recommendation. So I am going to pause here. I do want to mention that I am going to be part of a panel talking about how we are using restorative practices on our campuses. And there are, I think, 5 or 6 of us. It's being facilitated by IIRP at the American College Health Association meeting next week. We are scheduled for Friday morning. So if you'd like to hear more about my experience or the experience of others at other institutions across the country, and hear more from the folks at IIRP, that's a great opportunity to build on this. But if that's not something you're able to do, I again will provide my slides, which has lots of places you can go to. And then also in my slide deck, you'll see my contact info, but also 2 important contact folks for either listening circle facilitator training or just maybe wanting to connect more to that collaborative that I mentioned for higher ed. So those are both there in my slide deck as well. So I'll pause there. I know we have just a little bit time left and see if Annabelle has any questions that have come in since I started speaking.
No, I have not had anything happen yet, but thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was very informative and I learned a lot. I'm sure you did as well. People should be able to unmute themselves as they see fit. So if you have questions or make welcome to and Stacy, if you mind sending the info over, if people want to learn more about the panel, we can share that out as well.
Sure. So the session itself will be Friday morning at 8 a.m. So hopefully you're a morning person, first thing in the morning on Friday. But happy to share more from that presentation as well if you're not able to be there and curious as to what was being shared.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions, so if they don't have anything, or send me an email, I'll let you know, and we can go from there. Well, that is all.